Hello and a very warm welcome to Chabahar Television. You're watching a brand new edition of India's World with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Amid US sanctions, Iran is exploring ways to increase its bilateral trade with India, including expanding banking channels. Only one bank has a business relationship with Iran. We need to expand that, said Hamid Reza Faulatgar, head of the 7-member parliamentary delegation from Iran that is visiting India to improve bilateral ties. Experts believe there is a need to sign free trade agreements with India to reduce customs tariffs on both sides to improve bilateral trade. The volume of trade between Iran and India stands between 10 and 13 billion US dollars, which has tremendous potential for improvement. Early this year, India had taken over operations of the strategic Chabahar port in Iran, opening a new strategic route connecting Iran, India and Afghanistan, bypassing Pakistan. To boost tourism, Iran had started offering stapled visa and e-visa to Indians. In March, several media reports suggested India is exploring the possibility of expanding its anti-terror partnership with Iran to counter terrorist activities allegedly launched from Pakistan's soil. There is immense potential to expand the bilateral relationship between the two countries. As Iran celebrates its Republic Day, we will analyze the India-Iran bilateral relationship. Joining me on the program today are D.P. Srivastav, former ambassador, Professor A.K. Pasha, Center for West Asian Studies, JNU, and Wail Awad, West Asia expert. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. What is the present or the current state of the bilateral relationship between India and Iran?
We have enjoyed excellent bilateral relations with Iran. And this is rooted in our historical ties, which go back to more than 2 millennia. So the period of sanctions is just a flicker. It's not going to change the thrust of those relations. And this takes into account our geostrategic location of the two countries. Iran is our neighbor's neighbor. So there's bound to be a community of interest. I would not like to speak on behalf of Iran, but yes, from Indians' perspective, our relations with Iran's role is essential for connectivity to Afghanistan as well as Central Asia. The second dimension is trade, and here Iran has always enjoyed a trade surplus. We don't mind that. Ours is an open economy. Even at global level, we run a deficit. The trade surplus is because Iran exports crude oil and our exports do not match. It took enormous effort during last round of sanctions to sustain these trade ties. And India worked out a rupee payment arrangement which has been revived. You mentioned that this needs to be, there must be some diversification. I agree with you, and I'm sure that our government is seized up with the matter. And the third dimension, which is again rooted in the geostrategic situation of the two countries, this is a threat both countries have faced from terrorism from Pakistani soil. People in India would recall that while Pulwama took place on 14th, a day before, terrorists based in Pakistan killed 27 members of elite Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps in Sistan Balochistan province. And the Iranian investigations confirmed that not only the attack had come from Pakistani soil, actually the main person was a Pakistani national. And there was, the modalities were identical. This Pakistani national, he blew up a car laden with explosives, just as what happened in Pulwama.
Right.
So I think the two countries have a lot in common, and they need to work together to expand these relations.
Absolutely. All right, we'll talk about how we can take the relationship to the next level. But before that, Wail Awad, I'd like to bring you into the picture. There are several media reports, in the recent weeks that have suggested that the India-Iran relationship could be going through under some strain or some stress because India is moving closer towards the countries in the Middle East. Is that the case?
Well, I think India is playing a very balancing act to keep good relation between every party that they are either at foe with each other or they are not friendly with each other. So I think India is trying to keep that safe distance between all these relations, keeping it in its mind the national interest of India and those particular. But I think India is still to really come forward to put its own national interest above the other issues, because here you're having lots of players in the region. There are many players who wanted to see that this relation does not foster this relation between India and Iran should be isolated, that India should fall in the line of the isolation of the American foreign policy. But I think India is doing the right things by convincing the world and the United States in particular that relation with Iran, it's it's a geopolitical, as Ambassador was mentioning also, and we should always remember that it is a natural extension of Asia is Iran and India. In fact, it was only during the colonial period that we had this separation between the two. And I think we are living in the 21st century of the Asian power. And India as an emerging power in the region and a major player in the international affairs, I think should be in a position to keep every party at peace, at bar from the internal affairs of Indian affairs at least, and India can maintain its sovereign foreign policy in regards to regional players. I think that will be good for India, because if you look at the advantage you get from supposedly, if you are not under the American pressure, imagine if there is a gas pipeline coming all the way to India from Iran. How much could be the reduction of the taxpayers in India? How much India will benefit out of it direct line? But because of the American, you are under the tremendous pressure. And I think India will be in a good position to keep this relation going strong despite the American threat.
Right. Talking about the Americans, Professor Pasha, how much of an impact have the US sanctions had on Iran, and how important is it for Iran then, to boost its relationship with countries like India and others?
Yeah, the Americans have imposed sanctions right from the day the Islamic Republic was established way back in '79. And the military intervention aggravated this problem. But officially, the US Congress passed this Libya-Iran Act to prevent any kind of investment beyond a particular limit. And after the nuclear deal was signed under President Obama, these sanctions were lifted. But under President Trump, again they have been reimposed, which is more or less continuation of what the US has been doing since '79, primarily for regime change. They don't like the Ayatollah's regime to continue for a variety of reasons, because they lost the strategic posts. Number two, the Americans now see Iran as a major destabilizing agent in the region. Its growing influence in Iraq, all governments have been pro-Tehran there in Baghdad after the Americans invaded. Then Syria has a strategic partnership with Iran. They have Hezbollah in Lebanon. They are accused of plotting in Yemen, in Bahrain, and various other places also. So the Americans are quite concerned about Iran's role in this region, which is primarily to safeguard the American regime change approach. Now, two more factors have been added to this American interest and sanctions, and that is the Saudi Arabian and UAE also have joined hands with the United States in their anti-Iran campaign. Plus Israel, the old ally of the United States. So a combination of American sanctions and Saudi, UAE efforts plus Israel makes it a very formidable challenge for Iran. And it is in this background that we have to see the waiver which was given to India and 5 other countries for import of oil until May. And that is going to expire very soon. The Americans have made it very clear that they are not going to give waiver any further. Beyond that, it has to stop the oil thing. But what is important for India to remember is the European Union has defied the US in retaining the nuclear deal with Iran, plus China and Russia. So India has to weigh its balance with Iran, keeping in mind this window of opportunity to coordinate with these three major blocs in the global politics. And America stands isolated in this place. So in that way, I think we have to weigh our national interest and then see if possible to coordinate with EU, Russia, China, plus other countries in the region, Turkey and Asian oil consumers in particular.
Right. That having been said, Ambassador, is it a tightrope walk for India then going forward? And what should our strategy be really in the months and the years to come?
Well, you put it very well. It's going to be a tightrope walk, but it is in the interest of both Iran and India to sustain this relationship, especially at this juncture when Iran is in a difficult spot. India's relationship with Iran is rooted in this region, AFPAC region, and it is our attempt is to insulate it from our relationship with the countries in the Arab world and beyond. And but in this region there is certainly a convergence, and Iran realizes it. The situation in Afghanistan is worsening, and it is in as much in Iran's interest as in India's interest that Kabul has a stable regime which can withstand the pressure from Taliban. As of now, there is a slight dissonance between the Iranian and the Indian positions on Afghanistan. But going forward, we hope that Iranian position will come in line with our position, as it happened during the 90s when both India and Iran opposed Taliban government in Kabul.
Right. So that having been said, Wailawad, why is the United States so keen on this particular region? Because the Trump administration is talking about, pulling troops out of Afghanistan, getting out of Asia, really not having, foots on the ground here in Asia. But yet they seem to be so keen on what's happening with Iran and others. What's the issue really?
I think the issue is Israel, because the Israel dominance in the region has to be retained and has to be protected by the United States foreign policy. If you can see what President Trump have declared, the Golan Heights, occupied Golan, Syrian Golan to Israel. I mean, this is something which is out of the context of the American foreign policy as a peace broker in the region. So therefore, if you see it from those angles, I think we should a little bit remember that the American foreign policy toward the region has always been Israeli centric, oil and gas, and that's the second source, and the army. So arm industry is very much strong. Then they are selling arms to the Gulf state because they are creating an enemy, and the enemy is Iran. So anti-Iran bloc is building, as Professor Basha was putting it on. But let me remind you and the viewers. I mean, in the 80s when the Contra gate was open, when the American did business, and the Israelis, by the way, did business with the Iranian in 1981 and 82, they sold them arms. So they were under sanction, yet they were doing their business because it served their national interest. And that money which they have generated out of the business, they armed the Contras in Latin America. In a similar fashion, they have done also with the Myanmar. Myanmar was the India position, has always been there, that we have a strong relation, we have a national asset, we have a national interest to keep our good relations with Myanmar. Here, India position was vindicated, that India has a very strong position toward Myanmar, and everybody now coming forward with Myanmar. Why can't be with Iran? So Iranian issue is a what we call a thorn in the truth of the United States, because the way you keep an anti-Iranian bloc alive, then you will have more of an armed industry sale in the region, and you will create more battle zones, and that is where the Americans are looking for. If you look at the way they created in Afghanistan immediately after the Iranian Revolution, they started with the Taliban, and they started with the Al-Haq in Pakistan, a hardcore Sunni blocks. So basically at the end of the day, they wanted to turn the fight in the region into a Sunni or Shia, and that's why they are building on those issues. So Iran, India position at this stage is to keep its national interest and also look at Iran as an asset. Is not only the oil. Not only politically, it's economically, it's historically, everything is a basket. India has to see it from those angles. And that is where India should weigh its position as an emerging power in Asia and a stabilizing power as well, that to tell the United States and its allies that, look, it's a time that we should have a stabilized South Asia, because you cannot have a prosperity if there is a problem in Taliban, in Afghanistan. Taliban, they are talking to the Taliban now because the American want it, but they remove the Taliban when they want. So why have we to go to follow the American steps when we have our own national interest to be taken first as a priority before we let the other dictate us where the foreign policy is? The United States is more bothered about the militarization of Asia Pacific, leaving a vacuum in the Middle East, and that vacuum has to be filled with the American allies. And America will be more than happy to see India, to see Israel, to see the other nations taking foot on the ground rather than allowing other countries to take influence, because Iran, as I was saying, they have given Iraq and the plate in a golden plate to the Iranian. The same thing in Syria, the same thing in Yemen, because the policy of the United States is to create an anarchy in those regions. And now this sentiment, anti-Iranian sentiment, is building up. So again, they will remove them. So it's a kind of a process, continue battle zone.
So it's a cyclic process, is what you're suggesting. Okay,
absolutely.
Right. So Professor, so what are the areas of convergence then for India and Iran, and what should we focus on?
Yeah, just before I answer that, there are two more factors. One is the Americans are worried that their allies like UAE and Saudi Arabia are being encircled by Iran, from the northern tier to Bahrain to Yemen, and Oman also, which has close relations with Tehran. So the fear after the Arab Spring in these monarchies was that they might also be under threat, and Iran is masterminding this people's revolution from below the Arab street, if you can call that way. So the Americans woke up that Obama was actually facilitating the Iranian pushover in this region. The number two American fear of Iran is the economic and military capability of Iran. Apart from Israel and Turkey, Iran is a major military capability power. It has a huge army, it has a fairly decent navy, and it has built up its missile capability, which can reach more than the regional parameters, if you can put it. So the Americans are worried that in spite of all the things they did, putting sanctions and all, the Iranians are continuing to build up their capability, and they have become self-reliant. Not so much on the oil revenues, but non-oil revenues also get them fairly decent. As far as India and Iran are concerned, Chabahar is a major link between the two countries. We can utilize it for not only Afghanistan, Indo-Iranian relations, but also Central Asia. Russia also is looking after. It is our answer to the Chinese Belt and Road initiative. It is our link through Kandla, Bombay to Chabahar to Turkmenistan and beyond to Europe. So in that way, it is a major convergence between Russia, Turkey, Iran and India. And the second one is, all said and done, after Russia, Iran has the largest, second largest gas reserves. And for the foreseeable future, we need Iranian gas. A lot of plans have been floated, like the IPI through Oman and this Turkmenistan gas pipeline. Nothing has worked. But still there is this hope that once things stabilize, Iranian gas would be helpful for our economic development if we have to have double-digit GDP to bring up people who are below poverty line. The third one is, the Americans, no matter what they do in this region, there is no denying of the fact that they are supporting the wrong horse, like they have done in Pakistan for the last 50-60 years, supporting military dictators, and who have had trouble. Now Americans themselves are tasting through the terrorism factor. So in that way, the regional dynamics of monarchies, oligarchs supported by the Americans and now the Israelis is a question mark there. So in that way, India has to weigh its policy about the long-term future as far as Iran is concerned. And there is this convergence between all of these countries and India, that we have to keep Iran as a factor no matter how close we become with Saudi Arabia, UAE and Israel in this region.
Sure.
Lastly, I think, you see, until 1992-93, when Prime Minister Narasimha Rao visited for the first time, an Indian Prime Minister, we were also concerned about the Islamic rhetoric which was coming from the Islamic Republic from 79. But now that is history. Iran has now become a status quo power. It is much more realistic, following pragmatic policy reflected through the nuclear deal. So all of this has convinced India that we can do business, especially after Iran's support to Kashmir issue in the UN Human Rights Commission along with China, which tilted because Saudi Arabia was supporting this human rights violation in Kashmir at the Geneva Commission. So in that way, we have to keep in mind the realistic, pragmatic approach of China, and they are willing to do business with India, no matter NDA or UPA.
Right. Closing comments now from all my guests, starting first with you, Ambassador. So are there any areas of the bilateral relationship that need special attention?
I think in the coming days, from Iranian perspective, the most critical thing is that their oil exports to India continue. And I think this is where the government of India has already made clear that for our own reasons, we are not in a position to make any substantial change, because the oil prices have started climbing up again in view of sanctions against Iran and Venezuela. At the same time, we have a very important relationship with US and with Arab countries, which will continue to be an important factor in our relations, but we can certainly accommodate Iranian interests in continuing to buy Iranian crude, and should be at some point a convergence of interest in Afghanistan as US prepares to withdraw or draw down its forces both in the Middle East as well as Afghanistan.
Absolutely. So are you saying that we may get another waiver post-May as well, as far as Iran is concerned?
I cannot predict the US policy, but yes, we have no option but to continue buying the Iranian crude. The amounts have already come down. It's now 50% of what we are buying a year ago, and it's a very sharp reduction. In the past, during the last round of sanctions, there was 20% reduction every 6 months. This time it is 50% reduction in one go. I don't think we can afford to let this come down further, because reduction means it's not simply reduction from Iran. Iranian exports everywhere are being curtailed, which means an overall scarcity and increasing prices. And there is every sign that the prices have already climbed up by 20%, despite the US shale oil production having gone up. So I think there is no way that we can reduce it further.
Well, Awad, so what's the best way forward for the India-Iran relationship?
I think you should strengthen the bilateral relation, which is very strong as such, but you need to look into the issues which is standing as a hurdle in front of the sanctions, like the banking, like the payment mode, like also the shipping and insurances, which is India has to see its own interest. I believe at the end of the day, neighbors will come together. You see, counter-terrorism measure is very important for both the countries, especially with the vacuum will be left in Afghanistan of the United States. Talk to the Taliban, and then you are having more of those terrorist organizations will target both the countries. So unless and until collectively terrorism has been fought, you cannot fight it all on your own. So therefore, you need the cooperation among the two countries in this front. And I think the CIS country where the hydrocarbon abundant resources are available there, and Indian market is also for Indian market should be encouraged and should be more of a maritime relation between the two countries. I think these are the issues India has to put forward its own national interest. Iran is an asset. Iran is a natural partner for India and cannot be ignored no matter what the American made. It's only the sanction will increase that backdoor business the black money business, which is only causing, it's a kind of, a harm to the people, where you are increasing the sanction on the public, not on the government, because government never suffer on the economic sanction. It's only the people who suffer. And despite all the United States sanctions, since the emergence of the Iranian revolution, they were able, as Dr. Basha was said, they were able to stand on their own feet. They were able to strengthen their position in the region, and also as an emerging power as well. And they are able to retain and steadfast all this kind of a pressure on them. Yet now the American taking a unilateral position. I think the European also taking a very strong position with Iran. Let us watch and see where India stands and how the relation will go forward.
Sure. And Professor Pasha, please close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Yeah, since we are having national elections, I think the new government would take a call on what our actual policy towards Iran ought to be, given the realities from the United States, this pressure not to import oil. But in a modest way, we can strengthen the bilateral relations, at least in two areas which are not covered by the United States sanctions. One is the Chabahar port. We have made a beginning, but that could really become a hub for our transit trade, not only with Iran, Afghanistan, but also Central Asia, for which it has been earmarked. The second one is the cultural contacts. Iranians, large number of them, because of various reasons, have not been able to go and study in the countries of their desire. They are looking for India. At one time they used to be the largest, but for some reason they have declined. But they want to send more and more Iranian students to come and study in various fields in India. I think that needs to be revived. And the third one is the tourism. The Iranians are willing to have a luxury ship connection between their Gulf Coast, Bandar Abbas or Chabahar with Bombay or Kandla.
Right.
So tourism also has great potential between the two countries, and these are not covered by the sanctions.
Sure.
No matter what the United States wants the countries to do. So in these two, at least beginning could be made. There is potential.
All right. There is immense potential really to bypass some of these sanctions as well, and to ensure that the Indo-Iran bilateral relationship reaches new heights is what the panelists are suggesting. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of India's World. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. We'd like to hear from you as well. Do share your feedback and your suggestions with us. Our email ID is indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles at FRP09 and at Rajya Sabha TV. That's it from me. See you again next time.